In this video, I'm going to show you how to animate constraints and blend that with keyframes for this obstacle course that I have here. So I am going to kind of come in close here. And right now I just have just a basic shape of a ball in the middle that's going to be animated through this obstacle course. But what I'm going to do, instead of just keyframing it all the way through, is I'm going to add animation constraints. I've got a couple of objects here that are rigged and can be interacted with so that I can, kind of hit the ball and make it move and do different things. And so on this one, I can animate the claw opening and closing so that it can pick up the ball and kind of move it around. So what I'm going to do is at first I'm going to have it pick up the ball. Actually, kind of a cool idea is to have it roll to the point where the claw is going to pick it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it back. Actually, what I'm going to do, because I want to have it pick up right here, right where I've kind of created the ball, I'm going to just kind of keyframe it right there. But I'm going to middle mouse drag it over to, let's say, about frame 19. And I'm going to keyframe it right there. I'm just kind of holding it in place while I keyframe it. I don't have to necessarily middle mouse and drag, but what that does is it holds the position where it was. It wasn't moving anyway, so it doesn't really matter, but that kind of shows you how I can middle mouse and drag that over to kind of hold its position. And then I can come back over here and kind of roll the ball backwards and press S on the keyboard again, and I can get it kind of moving. But I would like it to rotate too. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to rotate that ball forward, and I can get it to say -180 just to kind of line it up pretty good there. And I'll kind of right click on that and key selected. So now it's going to be sort of rolling in place, and it's probably not ideal. So I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to go a whole another 180 degrees, just kind of get a nice, take it to 360, get a nice roll off on the ball, and right click, key selected. And now I kind of have it rolling. It's probably not the best roll possible, but at least it kind of gets it rolling. And if I really want to kind of give the illusion right now, I just have a material, basic material on it. I'd probably want to add something so it looks like it's actually rolling, because if you keyframe it that way without any kind of texture, any kind of indicating that there's some sort of material or texture on there that shows like it's rolling, then you're not really going to perceive it. But that gets me kind of to the point where I can see it rolling when I select it, right? Now what I'm going to do is I want this claw to go down and pick it up. So I want to key that. What I'm going to use is these animation controls, or these curves that are created as sort of a rig to key that. So I'm going to press S on the keyboard right now, right there, because I want it to start right there. And actually, again, I'm going to come back here. I'm going to have it keyed about right there. And then I'm going to have it come down pretty quickly. And I'm going to have it pick up the ball. So I'm going to move it into place. And I can get a little closer to that, pressing F on the keyboard. It zooms it in, or it frames up the selection. So, and I'm going to sort of get that lined up with the ball here pretty well, just to make sure it's kind of in the center. It doesn't have to be exact, but as close as I can. So it's going to go down, claw's going to go down. And actually, I'm going to move this. I'm going to hold down Shift and click that one key and move it over a little bit, because I want it to move, kind of want it to move a little bit faster than that, or slower than that, sorry. And then I'm going to adjust kind of how that's happening a little bit later, but right now it kind of gets me to the point where it needs to be. And then in a couple frames, I am going to close the claw. So I'm just using this little control, and I select this control. I've got it rigged so that it does this claw open and close kind of thing. And so I'm going to key that right there, key selected. And one thing I realize when I do this is it kind of goes through the ground. So what I can do is kind of just lift this up a little bit. So I'm going to bring the claw up just a tad, and then key that. And then it'll close down. It still looks like it's going through the floor a little bit, so I can adjust it a little bit. It's not going to be that big of a deal, because sometimes you can make little adjustments after I kind of refine my animation. And probably what I'd end up doing is sort of key this, where it might be going through the ground just a little bit, or kind of get it to the point where when it's picking up, or when it kind of goes to pick up the ball, that it actually going to lift the ball up a little bit. So I could just sort of animate the ball so it looks like it's being picked up there. But I would need to make sure that I duplicate that key for exactly when it starts to grab onto the ball. So I just shift and drag that over, or hold down shift and click the key, and I can just move it over to kind of adjust it. So now it looks like it's kind of lifting the ball when the claw closes. I'm being a little precise with that, but that's okay. It'll make it look kind of like a cool animation when I do that. So it looks like it picks up the ball when the claw engages it. So now if I want to animate the claw going away with the ball, I could keyframe it. I mean, that is kind of one way you could go about it. And I could grab that, the claw control there once it picks up the ball, and then I can have it move away. So I'm gonna actually pull it up and then move it over a little bit, move it over here, because I'm gonna have it drop on this other control over here. And if I keyframe it there, right, you notice that the ball, I'd have to keep keyframing the ball to make it go with it. But I'm gonna do constraints. I'm gonna use constraints to make it a little bit easier, right? So I get to the point where it's engaging the ball, and to the point where right before it's going to lift and take it away. And what I'm going to do is I am going to add a constraint. And when you add a constraint, constraints will, unlike parenting where you sort of add something in hierarchy, the ball, I could add it to this group in the hierarchy. I could just kind of sort of a hierarchical parenting. I can just add it to it and it'll go with it. But you can never, it'll always be moving with it. So if I move the claw, the ball will go with it. So what I'm going to do is what's called a constraint. So there's multiple different types of constraints. And I am going to use, in this case, I'm going to use a point constraint. I can use a parent constraint. Parent constraint will control it both by movement and rotation, but I'm not going to be rotating the claw at all, so I'm going to use a point constraint. And all that's going to do is when the claw moves, translates X, Y, or Z, the ball is going to go with it. So what I need to do to create that is I select the control, select the parent, or what's called the driver, and I shift select the child, which is sometimes called the driven. So I'm going to go to constraint, point constraint, options. I want to make sure this maintain offset is checked. If I do not have that checked, if I don't go to the options and make sure that that's checked, the ball will move to the control. It will not maintain its distance from the control. It'll jump to it when I set up the constraint. I want it to be the same distance as it is right now. So I make sure that maintain offset is on. I can also constrain certain axes. In this case, I want it to move X, Y, and Z, so it's constraining all. If I wanted it to just move left to right, but not go up and down with this claw, I can just choose the X. It would go left and right, but would not go up and down if I don't choose Y. So I want it to do everything, X, Y, and Z. So it's constraining all the axes, and I want it to be a weight of 1. So when the parent moves, the child moves. I'm going to click Add. If I were to click Apply, it would keep this window open. And then I could apply the constraint to something else, but I'm going to click Add, which is going to add the constraint and close the window. Now, when I do that, you're going to see this blend point 1. What that means is I've already had keyframes on the ball. And then when I added a constraint, it added, you notice it turned green on these translates on the ball. What that means is now that ball is being controlled by 2 different things. It's being controlled by its keyframes, and it's being controlled by a constraint. The blend point 1 means it's blending with this point constraint down here. When it's set to 1, it's going to completely obey the point constraint. So right now, when the arm moves or when the claw moves, the ball is going to go with it. What that also means is the previous keyframes that I had are not being obeyed at this point in time. So what I need to do is animate that blend point to go from one to the other. So when it's at 0, it's going to obey the keyframes. When it's at 1, it's going to obey the point constraint. Now, depending on how you set it up, if you didn't have keyframes at first, that blend point might be set to 1 or 0, depending on when you put the constraint. But the important thing to realize is when it's at 0, it is going to be off. When it's 1, it's going to be on. So I need it to be 0 until it actually gets picked up, right? And since the claw is moving here, I'm going to go 1 frame before, and I'm going to set that to 0. And I'm going to right-click on the blend point 1. If it was a parent constraint, it would say blend parent. If it's a orient, it would say blend orient. I'm going to key that. So that's the blend point 1 at 0. I'm going to go 1 frame, and then I want it to obey the point constraint. So I'm going to add a 1. Now I could have keyed it before when it was at 1, but it doesn't matter which direction you go. I'm going to set it to 1 at this point in time. So it's 0 when it's going to obey its keyframes. And then as soon as I want it to obey the parent constraint or the point constraint, I set it to 1. Now that it's 1, it's going to move with the claw. So I have it going from being animated to then kind of being, as the claw picks it up, it's then the blend point, the point constraint down here is now going to be applied. And then the claw will pick up and move with the ball. A couple things to note here in the point constraint when you add that. These offset values are where the ball, how far the ball is away from its constraint, the object that it's constrained to. So the claw control is what it's constrained to. So this right here is the claw control. When you look at that ball, it's going to show you the point constraint underneath. Also, when you look in the outliner, that constraint is going to be added underneath it. So you can actually select that point constraint and see that value right there. But when you look at the ball, when it's parented, that's kind of how it's all set up, is this point constraint is parented to the ball. When you look at that, it's going to show you the offset from the control or from this control. When this is set to 1, it's obeying that control. You could also key this and set it to 0, and it's not going to obey that control, right? So, but right now it is set to 1. If I enter 0 and then move it, it's not going to obey that, right? So if I set it to 1, it will then obey that constraint, right? So that's how that kind of works. If I set up multiple point constraints or multiple parent constraints, whichever constraints I create, you sometimes will see multiple controls down here in the point or the parent constraint or whatever constraint you have with the object. When that happens, you can key it from one control to the next, and I'll kind of show you how that works. So here I have the claw, and I'm going to add some more frames to my animation so that I can work with a few more frames. And I'm going to animate this claw going up. Since I have it going to this point, I'm going to actually go a few more frames, and I'm going to have it move over and kind of above this little platform that I've got created right here. And I'm gonna end up dropping the ball. I want to kind of drop it down on top of the platform. And the idea is I'm going to get the platform to kind of move with it, right? So I'm going to key that right there. I'm going to key the claw right there. So it comes up, moves, and connects, right? So now that I've got it connected, now that I've got it kind of hovering above the this platform, I'm going to drop the ball. So I'm going to kind of go a few more frames. And what I can do is do the open and closed jaw. So right here, I had keyframed it. So it's closed at 10. And then a few more frames later, let's go to about right here, I can open it. So I'll set it to 0. And I can always adjust my timing later. And I'm going to key that, key selected. So it's going to open that. And right now, it's still point constrained. So it's not going to, obviously it's not going to drop. But what I want to do at that point in time, when it drops it, when it starts to drop it, I actually want to keyframe it, right? And I'm going to kind of get it to the point where it just first starts to kind of open its claws. And that's where I want to kind of move that key. So I'm going to move it where sort of it starts to let go, the claw starts to let go of the ball. Now, when I get it to this point, since I'd keyed it, it's going to stay where it's at even when I remove the constraint. So if I set this to 0 and I key that, now it's back on its keyframe. So I'd set a keyframe right there, but you see it's, kind of blending between the two, which I don't really want. So I need to go one frame before and again set it to 1 because it was gradually going from its previous 1 to 0, right? So I need to go back 1 and key it again, right? I need to key it so it's on because I'm treating this like it's a switch. It's on, it's off, right? And so that way it's going to obey the claw. It gets up here. It's still on this frame, but then it's going to let go. And then what I want it to do is I want it to drop. So I'm going to go just a few frames, press W on the keyboard to get it to move, and I'm going to drop it down. I'm going to zoom into this a little bit so I can kind of get closer to the ball. And I'm going to key it about right there. So press S on the keyboard, back up a little bit. Okay, and now I can kind of see that it's blending. It's attached to the claw. It's got the point constraint. It's released, and then it starts to drop. Now, if I don't like the timing of that, I can back these up. I can hold down Shift, and I can drag across both keys, and I can move it like this so that it looks like when the claw lets it go, it drops, right? And it's going to hit this object. I want the platform to respond to the ball being dropped. So once it hits, I then want to constrain the ball to this ring. And since it's going to be rotating, the ball doesn't need to rotate, but this will rotate. I can add a parent constraint. The ball's not necessarily going to rotate with it, but I can set it up as a parent constraint just in case I would like it to. I can have it rotate, but I could also use a point constraint. I don't necessarily need an orient constraint, but I'm going to use a parent constraint in this case. So again, I'm going to select the ring as the parent, shift select the ball, go to the constraint menu, go to parent options, make sure the maintain offset is selected, and both the translates and rotates are included in this constraint, and I'm going to add it. Okay, remember we had the blend point 1, now we have a blend parent 1 because we had a point constraint, and now we've added a parent constraint, and that parent constraint is to the platform. Again, we have some offsets, right? We maintained the offset, but we have these rotational targets, decomposition targets, but there's other attributes in the attribute editor that we can control. I'm not going to worry about that. I just want to make sure that it's going to the platform. So now it's obeying the platform, but as soon as it drops, I don't want it to. So I want to key that at 1 when I want it to obey this platform, and I'm going to go one frame before and turn it off. I want to turn it off right there. So again, key selected. Right now, it's at that point in time, it's going from a point constraint to keyframes, and then to a blend parent 1. It's going to this parent constraint, so which is the platform down here, right? And now, if I rotate the platform around, so I want it to kind of react, I'm going to key it right there. Actually, I'm going to go move it back. Yep, that's it right there. And then I am going to rotate the platform. Sorry, let me get it back here because I want to go to the point where I want it to rotate. And I'm going to rotate the platform around. So notice that it's flipping around. So I'm going to have to adjust this so that it maintains that kind of offset right on that. So I'm going to animate it. I'm going to kind of counter animate it a little bit. Right? So it might have been better for me to add a point constraint. Then I wouldn't have had to do this because it's going to be stuck to where the control is in its pivot point. Right? So the fact that I added a parent constraint probably wasn't the best for this sort of object, but I'm going to still kind of use it because I wanted to we're going to figure it out from here. Right? So I'm going to rotate it kind of around here, but I'm going to just kind of move it to about right there. Right? So it drops and it does this, right? So what I can do is select the ball, and then I'm going to go over here where it is. I'm in the channel box right now, and I'm going to go to the attribute editor. In the attribute editor, it shows the ball, that's the transform, the ball shape, which is the mesh. It shows the pair blends, and these are what's blending it to the point constraints. These are the pair blends. That's the point constraint, and if I click the right arrow over here, by the way, if that doesn't show, you need to move this window over. You just kind of drag the edge of this window over if that doesn't show. So if you go to that parent constraint, you'll see that right here I have the target offsets. That's the translates and rotates. That's where it's offset from the control. The cool thing about this, and the only way you can get to this is by going to the attribute editor, is I can actually press T on the keyboard, sorry, W on the keyboard for the move tool, and I can kind of move it up. Now, if I just try to key it, it's not really going to obey both, right? It's not going to obey the translates and the rotates that I put in here. But I can kind of rotate it around, right? And get that to sort of be at the point where I want it to be on the platform. I'm probably going to have a little bit of movement, but that's okay. So I can kind of move it around and rotate it. Now, if I just started playing my animation or tried to key that, it's not really going to work. What I want to do is I want to update these translates and rotates for the offset. So if you see this little update button, you click that and it's going to take the translates and rotates from the ball and it's going to update the offsets to that. And then you click key. What it's going to do is it's going to key that right there. Now I'm going to go back. Notice it's kind of flying through, but that's okay. It's because I didn't do it at the very start, which is probably the better way to do it. Sort of set that at the very beginning. But I'm going to do it from here so I can kind of reset it, right? Now, if I go to right there is where it was kind of keyed right before, I can actually update that and key it right there. And I'm actually going to bring it down a little bit just because it would be naturally kind of falling down. And then I'm going to update and key it right there, right? And now I've got it keyed as the offset from this parent constraint. Now, as I roll through it, you're going to see it's probably going to move a little bit. So I need to kind of do another little update somewhere in the middle here. So again, I just kind of move it up. I can move it around a little bit too because it's going to move on this platform as the platform moves. And I'm probably going to move out a little bit because the platform is causing it to do that. And then I can update and key, right? And now it hits and then carries through. And if I need to make any kind of adjustments, I can do that, right? And I'm going to move it over here a little bit because I think it would still move kind of that way a little bit. Update and key, right? And so it does that. So if it's going through the geometry a little bit, it's not that big of a deal. I can fix it later in the graph editor, which is usually what I end up doing, right? So boom, and it hits. And I've just used this ball parent constraint in the attribute editor. If you look at the channel box, that's right here. That's where the parent constraint is right there, but you don't see those values. So you have to go to the attribute editor to see this, and you've got to go to that parent constraint. Now, the point constraint doesn't have that, so you don't see the update and the key. This is just the offset value. You can see here there's the point constraint attributes, there's the offset here, but it doesn't allow you to do that kind of thing where you update and key those offsets, which is kind of a cool thing about the parent constraint. Anyway, so the next step that I would end up doing as I kind of move this through my obstacle course, and I probably at this point in time, I might just end up dropping it on this channel. And the way I've got this set up is that I can kind of reposition all the props in this and make a different obstacle course when I make it go through. But the next step that I'd probably end up doing is creating or modifying my keys, right? So I can go to Window and, Animation Editors and Graph Editor, and I can go through and sort of modify my sort of the motion as it's going through. So in one case that I was saying that I could go through and kind of modify the constraints, I can actually modify, I can, sort of blend my I'm going to reunify these tangents, just set them to automatic, and then kind of get a nicer fall off on that one specific key, right? So I see here that I've got this parent constraint, and it's, you know, kind of jumping from one to the next. So all these constraints are what's happening in here, right? That's kind of where that's showing up. I can select the ball and I can see, oh, like here it was moving and rotating. But I can go through and modify my keys based on what's going on in my scene. So if you kind of see where it's kind of going through the geometry here, that's this translate and rotate of the platform control, the target offset. So when I go to Window and Animation Editors and Graph Editor, and you look at what's going on, what sort of these constraints are, this is the offset rotate and offset translates, right? So somewhere right around in here is where I'm getting a little bit of a problem. So I can kind of just set that to automatic, and I can kind of adjust it. And you can kind of see, if I move it over here a little bit, when I adjust this a little bit, you're probably going to see it move in the scene, right? If it's not good enough and it's not doing what I need it to do, I can kind of add another key and get it to kind of to fix it. So that's the translate Y. I can look at the translate X and the translate Z and see if those are doing anything that I need to modify. So I'm going to, again, set that to automatic, just to kind of unify the tangents. And if I want, I can sort of adjust that a little bit to kind of fix what's going on with the ball, because that's usually going to be enough to get it to stick to the geometry. But that's what it's doing right there. Hopefully this has been helpful. I'm going to, I'll continue to create more animation in this and come up with a nice little obstacle course scene. But right now I have it rolling, and I got a point constraint where the claw picks it up, it drops it, where I go back to keyframes, and then it goes to a parent constraint and moves with this platform, this rotating platform. So I'd kind of keep adding to this and modify it to get a nice little scene going on in this obstacle course.